Okay, welcome to this UFM Community Learning Center Zoom presentation. I'm Linda Tiener, the director at UFM. I need to let you know that we are recording this session and we'll have it available for a few days for others to be able to view. Tonight, we're pleased to welcome Sarah Bell for her presentation, Politics on the Platform, Women's Suffrage at the Chautauqua. This program is brought to us by Humanities Kansas, an independent nonprofit spearheading a movement ideas to empower the people of Kansas to strengthen their communities and our democracy. Sarah Bell holds a PhD from the University of Kansas in history and is the development officer at the Watkins Museum of History in Lawrence. Her research interests include late 19th and early 20th century U.S. history, women and gender studies, and public history. Her dissertation studied women suffragists' participation with the Chautauqua movement and considered the interaction between cultural institutions and political reforms. Sarah joined the Humanities Kansas Speakers Bureau in 2018. Some housekeeping, please be sure to mute your computer during the presentation, and it will save you some bandwidth if you turn your video off as well. You'll still be able to see and hear Sarah and the slides she's going to present. Sarah will stop periodically for you to ask questions, but you may also ask questions in the chat box and I will pass those on to Sarah. So now please welcome Sarah Bell.
Thank you so much, Linda. Well, it is so great to be giving this presentation once again. I had given quite a few earlier this year, and my last one that I gave, I think, was on March 11th, and then everything shut down, and here we are 3 months later. So you all are the lucky first group to be my my first try at a virtual presentation. So I appreciate you giving me all of the grace that I may need as we go through this today. But yeah, as Linda said, I will check in with you every now and then, but feel free if you have a question. One of the nice things about doing this via Zoom is that you all have a front row seat to my photos. And so if there is something that you have a question about that you see in one of the photos on my slides, something that I say, and you want to ask that right then and not wait for a time for me to check in, feel free to just drop that in the chat so we can discuss it at that moment. So my presentation today, as you heard from Linda's introduction, it's a variation of something that I researched for my dissertation. And when I first started looking at Chautauqua way back in 2012, actually, I was thinking about this, but really started seriously studying it in 2015. And thankfully, you will all be happy to hear this presentation is not as long as my dissertation, but it is parts of it. And my original interest in looking at how Chautauqua intersected with women's suffrage started when I found a source early into doing this initial research that said that Susan B. Anthony and Anna Howard Shaw came to the Ottawa Chautauqua in 1892 and spoke about suffrage. And this immediately generated all sorts of questions for me. I was curious, why Ottawa? Why do they go to the Chautauqua? Because knowing how radical suffrage was perceived still at this time, especially in the late 19th century, and the religious respectability that the Chautauqua really held, I wondered how these two really prominent suffrage leaders wound up in this small town speaking at a Chautauqua in the early 1890s. So my presentation today is the answer to that question. So I'm going to be taking you from 1874, when the Chautauqua began in Western New York State, to about the first decade or so of the 20th century, when suffrage was a regular topic on the Chautauqua platform. I have examples from New York, a few from Colorado even, but most of them are from Kansas. And this is for a couple of reasons. I am not a native Kansan. I know it's probably bad enough that I'm coming to you from Lawrence. I did have a KU background earlier, but I switched it to a Chautauqua one for this presentation. But I actually grew up in Missouri, and I never really ever thought I would end up living in Kansas. But what I have found in the last 10 years that I lived in this state, I've really grown to love and appreciate this state. And it's primarily through the study of history that I've done and the study of women and women's history and their political activities. And so I just find it really enjoyable to share that history with Kansans. And also because what I have found from my research is that Kansas has this really unique and fascinating history of social reform, and women were so often right at the heart of them. So I'll be walking you through the timelines of two major movements, the Chautauqua and women's suffrage, but I will be including some other women's reforms too. And I'm going to show you why I decided to bring these two timelines together in conversation with each other, and the significance of why I feel like of studying why these two movements intersected. I mentioned already, I have a lot of great photos. Most of them are actually from the Franklin County Historical Society, where the Ottawa Chautauqua was, but others are from the Kansas Historical Society too. So with that, what is the Chautauqua? So I mentioned the Chautauqua began in 1874 in Western New York, and you'll see I have a few pictures up here for you to see. The one on the top left is, of course, map of, top right, get my directions, is a map of New York, and you'll see that I've highlighted the county far out to the west in red. That is Chautauqua County. And the star is a very rough approximation of where the Chautauqua was started and is still today. So the Chautauqua was started by two men pictured here, Methodist minister John Vincent and Methodist businessman Lewis Miller. They wanted to model the Chautauqua Assembly after the revivalist camp meetings that really had gotten their start with the Second Great Awakening, especially in this burned over district that included New York. And it was something that really had taken hold in the 1840s and 1850s, especially within the Methodist Church. So these revivalist camp meetings, there's a lot of focus on being outdoors, worshiping the sacred, very evangelistic. And they wanted to have aspects of it, but they didn't want all aspects of it. Because by the time it got into the 1870s, these were kind of known for being a little bit over the top, a little bit more spectacles. And they got their name Chautauqua because, as I mentioned, it is also named after the county and the lake. But it was actually originally named for a Native American tribe that was located in this area. And so a lot of questions I will often have for someone who has not heard of Chautauqua before is if it has something to do with Native Americans. And really, other than its name, it did not. But that is how it got its name. So Vincent and Miller wanted to start this assembly, having this idea of being outdoors, kind of worshiping the sacred, but they wanted it also to be a place for education. And in fact, the first year that they did the Chautauqua, they really wanted to train Sunday school teachers, who at this time, in 1870s, were primarily women. And so they coupled this idea of having this education, this kind of moral education, with a leisure experience that included this being outdoors in this natural space. And it was so successful in this first year that the Chautauqua became this annual summer event where visitors would come for 7 to 10 days at first when it had its start. They would camp in tents, listen to lectures, have discussions with their fellow attendees, and attend musical performances. And you can see in the picture that I have, the third one here, from 1881, this is a picture of the Chautauqua in New York. And why I like to include this photo is to show that in less than 10 years, this is how much it had expanded. And the other thing I want to note is, if I didn't tell you this is Chautauqua, you would probably guess it was some sort of a town. The way that it is organized very neatly with its streets, with all of these different blocks. And in fact, if anyone has been to the Chautauqua, which I actually did get to go a few years ago, it feels like you're walking around a town or a village, and that was very intentional. The other thing I want to point out, let's see if I can show you with my mouse, but along this the bottom part, that says, it's upside down, but it says Chautauqua Lake. And that is one of the prominent features of the Chautauqua in New York, that it was built alongside this lake, really giving it, and so that they really took advantage of the real estate they had along this lakeside. Now, the Chautauqua was not only popular in New York, its success led to the spread of other Chautauqua assemblies across the country. Because of course you can imagine that not everyone would have been able to make the long trip to New York. But those who were able to go to New York often came back to their towns and they were just raving about how wonderful the Chautauqua was and that they should start one of their own. And so these assemblies started to pop up. And I have a map here that shows an approximation of, in 1902, the number of different Chautauqua assemblies across the country. These were known as independent or daughter assemblies, and they were modeled directly after the New York institution, down to some of the very same programs and lecturers that they would have in New York would travel around the country to these other assemblies. All these different assemblies maintained their emphasis on religious education throughout. But as it grew in popularity and success, it started to expand its topics to other issues of the day, more secular issues such as science and current events, arts, literature. They included activities for children. So while it started as really a focus on teaching Sunday school women, it did not remain just focused for women. And I want to point that out because even though I did focus in my presentation, my research and this presentation on women's interactions with Chautauqua, Chautauqua had women, men, families, children, all that participated. So you can see that by 1902, there were an estimate of over 100 assemblies across the country. And I started one in particular, which was located in Ottawa, Kansas. And that is where I focus in on a lot of my research. And the reason for this is that Ottawa Kansas actually had the first Chautauqua assembly west of the Mississippi River. And it wasn't in Ottawa, but it started in Bismarck Grove, which was just outside of Lawrence. And it eventually bounced over to what became known as Ottawa. What was fascinating to me, though, when I was looking into the research of the Ottawa Chautauqua, is that why it didn't do well at Bismarck Grove. I don't know, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Lawrence history, but Bismarck Grove was known as this location for temperance gatherings, especially in the 1870s and 1880s. And one of the things about the Chautauqua is what it was really well known for is that there was no alcohol allowed. John Vincent, one of the founders, was an avid prohibitionist. He was so against alcohol that he didn't want it at any of these assemblies. And so the fact that Bismarck Grove, known for its connection to prohibition, to temperance, an outdoor space, had all of these elements, didn't do well with the Chautauqua, it's just really fascinating. The research says that the people of Lawrence didn't seem to be overly excited about the Chautauqua. And so it actually moved over to Topeka for 1 year. And it didn't do well in Topeka because even though Kansas had passed the Prohibition Amendment in 1881, in 1882, the year it was in Topeka, I guess Topekans were still drinking alcohol because according to some of what I've read, the Chautauqua could not stay in that town because of alcohol was still all around. So it landed in Ottawa the following year. You can see in 1883. And that is where it stayed, and it lasted for more than 30 years. So Ottawa was not the only Chautauqua assembly in Kansas, but it was the longest lasting one, and arguably probably one of the most successful. But some of the other locations that had Chautauquas included Winfield down in southern Kansas, Lincoln Park, Wathena, and several others that didn't have quite as long of lasting. Now, one of the things about the Chautauqua is that these assemblies tended to be located in rural or small towns. They were intentionally not in urban or city centers. They wanted it to be more out into these rural areas, in part because of the idea that it was supposed to be in nature. So what's interesting is that in 1896, Ottawa had a population of 6,000 people. And the Chautauqua, defining itself being part of this rural community, quoted itself as saying, "The Ottawa Chautauqua is sufficiently far from large cities to be free from their vagabond, disreputable classes, and possesses all the charms of rural quietness with nearly every convenience of metropolitan life." So interesting phrases that they're using, of course, with being far from these cities, with all of those challenges that the cities brought with it, but yet still having the conveniences that the cities and towns offered. And some of the other language at the time, they would say that the Chautauqua is an ideal city, a tented city of delight, and some of these and other phrases. And so the Ottawa Chautauqua also, like so many of the assemblies, strive to kind of balance this being the perfect blend of rural and urban. And you can see here with these photos that I have, one being the entrance to Forest Park where the Chautauqua was held, and the other, what was called Terrace Row. That even in a place where you were camping out in tents, they still wanted to simulate the idea that you were in a town or a city, lining up their tents in these neat rows, just like what you saw with the map of the New York Chautauqua. And so you can also see, of course, some of the different people who were present at the Chautauqua, including a mixture of women and men. Now, in addition to hosting an annual summer gathering, the Ottawa Chautauqua published a monthly newspaper, which they called the Ottawa Chautauqua Assembly Herald. This is where they advertised a lot of their programs and what was going on. And this picture, you may actually be able to read. I always joke to at my presentations that no one can ever read this. I'm just kind of putting it up for effect, but you might actually be able to read some of the details. But what I wanted to show with this is one page of one of the paper in the paper of the Ottawa Chautauqua Herald, and I have pulled out an inset from May 1894, and over here on the right is that inset, and this is Temperance Day. And this is an entire day of activities that people could partake in at the Chautauqua, just one day. So it starts off at 6:30 a.m. with morning prayers, and it goes all the way down to 8 o'clock in the evening with a lecture about tie up the dog, by the way, in case you were curious or couldn't read it. And what this is trying to show, what I wanted to get across to you all, is that one of the really interesting things about Chautauqua is that you could literally pack your day if you chose. You would have something nonstop from 6:30 a.m. to 8 o'clock at night, where you could be engaging with some kind of a moral education or a religious experience, whether it's prayers or having a discussion with your fellow attendees, but you could be activating your mind the entire time. And what I think is really interesting about this is that this was something that was really geared primarily for the Protestant white middle class. And I'll be talking more about that here in just a second, but Chautauqua was emerging at a time when the idea of taking leisure and vacation was becoming more popular. And yet it was saying, okay, you can take this vacation, but you can't be too leisurely. You still need to be engaging your mind and be doing things. And so the Chautauqua really made sure that they had plenty to do. But what's also interesting is I wanted to compare to today. So this is a screenshot of a calendar from the year that I went to the New York Chautauqua in 2017, and this is the shortened version. So when I arrived for my week at the Chautauqua, I received an 11 by 17 piece of paper that was packed with all the events that I could partake in for that day. And so this shows you a little bit of that shortened version, but same kind of idea is that from early in the morning till late at night, you could still be doing something every hour of the day. Of course, you could choose to also sit in your tent or, in today's term, go back to your cabin, but you had that option there. The other thing that I think is important to note is that religion, or as I call it, interfaith, is really continuing to be an important theme for the Chautauqua even today. And so it was really fascinating, and I could spend way too long talking about the comparisons of being there in the 21st century after having studied it in the 19th century, but it was really fascinating to see some of that in real time. But back to the historical. So I really like these pictures because they show close-ups of some of those, if you remember that terrace row that I just had a couple of slides ago, you can see a close-up of some of the people who were actually living in those tents. And as I mentioned, this Chautauqua was really geared for this particular group, white, Protestant, middle class. And you can see that with some of the numbers of what it actually cost to attend a Chautauqua. And really in today's terms, it's not a direct comparison, but what you're kind of seeing is an equivalent that would be about $1.50 for a 10-day season pass, in which in today's terms is about $7, $7 to $10, and $42, excuse me, for a season ticket if you were going to be there for an entire week. So that's not bad. And they could rent a tent for $5 in 1890 terms, which is about $140 today. So definitely it was trying to be geared to be very affordable to this particular class of people. And people could come for a day, people could come for an entire week, and so the Chautauqua assemblies tended to attract more of the rural and because they were in the rural and small town venues, farmers, teachers, club women, and other middle class professionals who wanted to participate in this leisure experience and who also had the time to do this. And so to go back to these photos for just a second, I mentioned earlier that even though I'm focusing more on women, that it wasn't just for women. And this photo on the left of the Whiteman family really does a good job of illustrating that. And I always joke, I have no idea if all of them slept in that tent or if they had a couple of tents, but you can imagine maybe, especially in the heat of a Kansas summer, that would maybe not have been the most comfortable camping experience. But the photo on the right is actually interesting too, because it shows a woman who perhaps brought her own cooking stove. I know that there was an option to actually rent some of the things that you needed if you didn't want to pack all of your stuff with you when you traveled to the Chautauqua. But one of the great features of the Chautauqua was that you actually didn't have to cook. They had dining halls, that was one of the appeals that, especially for women, they could attend the Chautauqua and they didn't have to worry about their regular chores for a week. So it's interesting to see a woman cooking here. And I have another picture later on, which is actually some women sitting at a dining hall. So I'm looking to see if I see some chats popping up. Means break for lunch. Yes, a food question. All right, thank you. Bring those questions coming. I'll check in here in just a second after this next slide to see if you have any more questions. But the last thing I want to emphasize is the nature experience of the Chautauqua. And I have a few photos here to kind of show some of the different variations of what the Chautauqua would have looked like, both in historical terms and today. So education was the prominent part of this program, but through it all, the original New York Chautauqua and all of the independent assemblies that occurred after, there was continued to be this emphasis on this idyllic natural space. And you can kind of think back to, this was probably most likely from the Methodist revivalist meetings and being outdoors and just like this worshiping of the sacred idea. But as this continued, I mean, likely as well, just it was nice for these Chautauquans to get to be together and have this leisure time outside. And so here you have a few examples of this. And I want to start actually with the top left. And I think too, again, you have a front row seat to these photos. Hopefully you can see within these mountains that there are some women hiking. And if you look really closely, you should see 4 of them. And they are hiking up, which if any of you know Boulder, Colorado, there's this really iconic mountain range called the Flatirons. And it's right behind the Chautauqua, which they still have going on today. And those women are hiking up the Flatirons in very long skirts. And I will say, I got to go to Boulder a few years ago to do some research, and I also, of course, had to do some hiking. And I was tired enough, and it was hard enough in my tennis shoes and shorts, let alone, and I kept picturing these women in their dresses, but kind of really just fascinating to see. And in my dissertation, I talk a lot more about Colorado, and in fact, I do this whole comparison between Ottawa, Kansas, and Boulder, Colorado, because I had a lot of overlaps. But one of the things I found so fascinating about Boulder is that they really prided themselves on being the best Chautauqua in the West, which for a long while, Ottawa had that title. They maybe gave themselves that title, maybe they were given to them, but they definitely used that title. And Boulder came in about 10 years later, 15 years later, and essentially took that title away. But as I tell people, you know, it's really hard to compete with mountains. And Boulder's still going on today. So you could argue that perhaps they were the winners. But they really, when they were advertising the Boulder Chautauqua, one of the things they said is that for women to bring their shorter skirts because they were going to be outdoors doing some rock climbing. So there you go. We have a photo, on the bottom left is actually the photo at Ottawa. And so again, you can see everyone gathered together. And I mentioned that this was in Forest Park. And it's, and I never say this right, I have it written down, but there's that river in Kansas. And you're not gonna be able to like respond back to me if I say it wrong.
Meridazine.
Every time. Meridazine. Thank you, Linda.
You're welcome.
So that was that river that goes through Forest Park. So that's where they held their Chautauqua. And I like to say, you know, I think this was probably dual purpose. Like, you know, it was beautiful to be in this park, and also you're going to have taller trees with shade for those very hot June and July days, which I know we are experiencing right now. And then the third photo is the photo that I took of that Chautauqua Lake. So the New York Chautauqua, I've mentioned a couple of times, is still going on today, as is Boulder. Those are two of the three Chautauqua assemblies that have been running continuously since their beginnings in the 19th century, which is pretty remarkable. Most of the other Chautauqua assemblies, including Ottawa, came to an end in around the 1910s. And this was for a couple of reasons. They really could not compete with the third iteration of the Chautauqua, which was the circuit Chautauqua. Now, a lot of times when I talk about Chautauqua, it tends to be, I think people are most familiar with Chautauqua with this third iteration, the traveling circuits. And this is where the Chautauqua, instead of you having to travel to a specific place, like New York or Ottawa or Boulder, the Chautauqua would come to you. And it sounds very similar to a circus. And in fact, there were, as I was kind of getting more into the 1920s, seeing some of those comparisons in newspapers where it would be, the circus would be in town and the circuit Chautauqua would be in town, and they'd have two different colored tents. And it was kind of like, are you gonna go to the circus where it's a little more sensational, or are you gonna go to the more morally uplifting Chautauqua? But even the Chautauqua the circuits started to kind of lose that connection to this religious education that had sort of originated in this New York Chautauqua and that the independent assemblies had upheld. And so you can see by the 1920s that they are starting to do more with theater performances, minstrel shows, a lot more entertainment-based rather than this religious education-based. And then the circuits really came to an end by the end of the 1920s. And there's some different theories about why, but most scholars believe it's because they couldn't compete with other growing forms of entertainment, including radio and movies, and the automobile, which means you didn't have to wait for anyone to come to your town. You could go out for your entertainment. So I want to pause here because this is where I usually take a break to say I'm going to be switching over to talk more about women at the Chautauqua. So if you have any questions about the Chautauqua up until now, let me know, and I'll answer those before I move on.
Sarah, there are two questions in the chat. The first one was, have looked around for Bismarck Grove just to check it out. No success. Is it possible to actually go to that site?
So I have not been, but I've heard that it's not very well marked, and that I know it is somewhere up in North Lawrence. And there is an approximate spot of, you can kind of see where it used to be, but there's nothing that indicates that was Bismarck Grove. I actually see Brian Moss is on this, and Brian, who lives in Lawrence, may know more than me. So Brian, if you do, shout out and correct me. But I know I'm sure there is someone who knows better than I do how to get there, but I know it's challenging to find it.
Okay, and the second question is sort of been answered. It's, do the meetings break for lunch, and did the people bring their own food? And a long day made people hungry and restless. So I don't know if you have anything else to add, since you talked about that a little bit.
Yep, so there was dining halls, and you could see people probably also did bring their own food. Actually, at a place like Ottawa that was big enough, and they had thousands of people showing up for their assemblies, there were actually vendors that would come to the Chautauqua. So you could buy your own food if you did want to cook it yourself that way. But again, the beauty of the Chautauqua is you didn't have to. Someone else was doing it for you.
Okay, the next question, do modern day Chautauqua still include a religious component?
Yeah, so the one in Boulder, Colorado is quite different from the one in New York. So the New York Chautauqua really holds true to its original form, which is having these gatherings, like thousands of people getting together, listening to lectures, small group discussions. And the Boulder one has moved more, it's very open. You can walk around the grounds, and they have focus on music as their musical performances, not many other lectures or other topics. The New York Chautauqua, I'll go back to it because I think it's worth showing again. So Chautauqua started as very Protestant, and this is something that, as I was looking into and kind of in the epilogue, as I called it, of my dissertation, I tried to sort of do this comparison of like a historical to today, because I found this really fascinating. When I went to the Chautauqua, one of the things they said is that they were really priding themselves on how diverse they had become. And I was kind of taken aback because when I was there, my impression was it was still pretty white, college educated, retired people. I mean, there wasn't like, from what I could tell, a lot of diversity, but where they really emphasized their diversity was in religion. And so you'll see here, interfaith is what they call their, like the interfaith lecture themes is something they have every week, and it kind of threads together all of their discussions. And they only I think it was in like the late 2000s, like 2009, 2008, they have all these different religious houses on the ground. So they had the Protestant houses there forever, but it was only like 2008 or 2009, they added a Jewish house, a Catholic house, and I believe they have an Islamic center and Baha'i possibly as well. So that is where they felt like they have really grown. So religion still is very much an underpinning, but not a Protestant focus.
And the next question is, were there separate activities for children?
There were. In fact, they had some things, and I don't know if it shows on this one. It probably doesn't. But sometimes you can see, actually, well, it does say stories for children, but in a young people's class. So they had kindergarten classes, they had boys clubs, they had girls clubs. And again, the idea was your kids would be occupied. So women, mothers, would not have to worry about their children, and they could go to their own talk on temperance or suffrage or some other kind of often domestic related, but they had that freedom.
Okay, and if you're interested in Bismarck Grove, look in the chat. There is a little conversation going on about where it might be and what it might be like. So I won't go into that. So you can read the chat to get that information. And that's the last of the questions that I've got.
Okay, well then I'll keep that. That last one was a good segue because now I will focus in on the second part of my presentation, which is really about women at the Chautauqua. So I like to give an overview of the Chautauqua itself because I want you to understand Chautauqua to really understand the significance of women's activities at the Chautauqua. So women were the primary audience from the beginning, Sunday school teachers, but Vincent had an interesting way of kind of viewing women. Women could be in the audience listening, but they themselves could not be lecturers. They couldn't present the information. And this was really because, to understand this fully, gender roles and separate spheres ideology at this time, which especially for the white middle class emphasized that women were in the domain of the home and men their domain was the public. And so men were able to do these public and professional activities like public speaking and teaching from a platform, but women should not. So Vincent was progressive enough to believe that women should be educated, but they should not be doing the educating in that way. However, his ban on women speakers did not last long. In fact, 2 years later, this woman, Frances Willard, was the first woman to speak on the platform of the Chautauqua. And she is most well known for her connection and her leadership with the Women's Christian Temperance Union, or the WCTU. And the WCTU was one of the largest and most influential women's reform groups in the US during the late 19th century. It was actually really remarkable how they grew, because they actually got their start at the Chautauqua. These women Sunday school teachers gathered together, and they were all talking about, something that we should have is they had all these separate temperance societies in their towns, that they needed a national movement to really get some action going on banning alcohol. So from this kind of grew the idea of the WCTU. So these women really emphasized this notion of home protection. They were justifying that they were okay to be in public talking about this and protesting for this, because they were drawing on their influence of being in the domestic sphere to protect the home. So that was, and usually if I'm standing up in front of the group, I take like a big step out to show like they're stepping out of their home sphere to the public, but they still have their base, one foot in the foundation of the home. So I mentioned that John Vincent he was a prohibitionist. He was very much against alcohol. And so even though he was reluctant to have women speakers, he recognized that women had this moral authority when it came to temperance, because of this argument they had that what was happening is that men were out in the public sphere. They were drinking away their paychecks, and they were coming home and beating their wives and children. And so that's why they had to protect the home. And so this was the necessity that women felt was so important. And so that is how Frances Willard used her connection to the WCTU to become that first woman speaker on the platform. So Willard was the first woman to speak at the Chautauqua, but she was not the last. Other women also started to lecture on temperance, literature, art, and music, but no suffrage. In fact, women who attended the New York Chautauqua were starting to voice their frustrations with John Vincent, because he would not give them space to discuss women's suffrage. One of the sources that it was probably the most beneficial for my research, was the Woman's Journal, which was a suffrage journal that was published out of Boston for more than 40 years. I looked at this from 1876 to 1917, and I did a search to see how they were talking about Chautauqua. And what I found is that there were all these letters being written to this journal talking about the Chautauqua, saying, great presentations about temperance and different things, but Vincent would not let them talk about suffrage. And again, I have to say, go back to what I just said. Vincent, who was, he became a bishop in the Methodist Church, would have been raised in this, very much steeped in this ideology of gender roles and separate spheres, that while the WCTU was justified to have this political participation, suffrage was too far. And this is because suffrage didn't just leave one foot in the home. People were afraid that it was actually pushing women out of the home. And they were not using home protection as an argument. They were saying, we just want suffrage. We want the right to vote. And this political cartoon, even though from several years later from the time I'm talking about, I think really exemplifies this really well. And you can see this fear about, if women have the right to vote, what is going to happen to the home? These poor men, these poor husbands and fathers are going to be left at home holding the crying children while the wife and mother is off voting. And so this was the fear, is that suffrage was going to be pushing this idea of gender roles and separate spheres way too far. Now, I want to take a pause from Chautauqua for a second, because I want to have all of you have this timeline in your mind about women's suffrage in Kansas, because this is also important to kind of understand the significance of what happened with Chautauqua and suffrage too. So I could do, of course, a whole nother lecture on just the women's suffrage in Kansas. And so this timeline does not do it due justice, but giving you this overview, you can see some of the main key dates associated with suffrage in Kansas, starting in 1861 with Clarina Nichols, who likely is our most famous Kansan connected with women's suffrage, who, because she attended the Wyandotte Constitutional Convention, was able to get women the right to vote in school board elections, as well as the most liberal property and guardianship rights for children at that time in the country. And this was really huge because the Married Women's Property Act really only has started to become the norm after 1848 when it was passed in New York. Before that time, once a woman was married, they really had no rights outside of their husbands. And so this was signaling that Kansas was really starting to take a lead when it came to rights for women. 6 years later, there was the first attempt in the country to pass a women's suffrage amendment to the state constitution, happened right here in Kansas, right in this very state. And I did not know this until I started studying suffrage and studied women's political history here. And it was such a phenomenon that it drew the attention of national leaders who had already been paying attention because of Clarion Nichols, and they came out here to help campaign. Sadly, not successful, but it did, you can see the next big step 20 years later, essentially an entire generation. Kansas had another first because it was the first state to grant women the right to vote in city elections. And this is also at the same time that Susanna Salter, the country's first mayor, Kansas's first woman mayor in the country, was also elected. And it had to do with the fact that women could vote in city elections. And this was really significant. And this is a fun little trivia fact for you to share with friends. But gold is known to be a color of the suffrage movement, and that is because I should like let someone type it into chat real quick, but it is because of the sunflower of Kansas, and it is because of these milestones that had been achieved primarily in 1887, this right to vote in city elections. 1894 was another attempt that also failed, and then finally in 1912, Kansas did get the right to vote 8 years prior to the 19th Amendment. And so Kansas, I really like to say, was a leader in a lot of ways when it came to pushing rights for women, and not just with suffrage. It was also the case with temperance and prohibition. Kansas was one of the first states to pass a prohibition amendment. I mentioned in 1881 with women's clubs. There was definitely a lot of churning going on in the state during this late 19th century, early 20th century time period. Now, this is a very famous picture, and it's popping up a lot this year because of the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. It is such a great photo, and it's, really to me what it's showing, and what people really believed at the time is that there was a wave moving across the country from west to east that was giving women the right to vote. And so Kansas was not the only state where women's suffrage was being discussed and moving forward. But you can see, and I love that Kansas kind of has like a little thumb sticking out here, the most eastern of those western states in 1912, but it was part of that western wave. And in fact, Kansans really prided themselves on being western during this time, and I think you can kind of see why. There's a lot of discussion about why it was in the West, more so than the East and the South, but the Western states were where suffrage was happening. And so Kansas was one of them. But let's get back to Chautauqua, because I said at the very beginning, Anna Howard Shaw and Susan B. Anthony spoke at the Ottawa Chautauqua in 1892, and which now was tied to this 1894 campaign. They were coming back to help campaign for that year. And so I've been telling you, John Vincent, reluctantly letting women speak about temperance and some other topics, but not talking about suffrage. So how did John Vincent go from not allowing women speakers at all to allowing women to speak, but not on suffrage, to finally including suffrage by 1892? Well, women pushed for it. And so in 1891, we have the first ever Women's Day at the Chautauqua. And I find this so fascinating because, of course, women had been at the Chautauqua. Women's topics had been there and discussed, but it was really key that it was called Women's Day, because during this day, there were two major topics being discussed. One was dress. So you can imagine the idea of bloomers were starting to kind of be a thing being discussed. A little too radical for most people, but just even talking about corsets and how restrictive clothes were for women. And the last half of the day was talking about suffrage. And in the newspaper for the Chautauqua, it was talking about this huge auditorium that they have that can seat 6,000 people, and it was covered all over in yellow ribbons for the yellow ribbons of the sunflower state of Kansas. Again, to acknowledge that 1887 vote that women had in city elections. And so other Chautauquas who were always paying attention to New York to see what New York was doing, paid attention to this as well. And so you see this immediate reaction on the part of Ottawa, who wants to copy and emulate New York, and they start their own Women's Day. In fact, they start a Women's Council. And so I mentioned before, Ottawa had this idea that it was the best of the West. And it, in fact, was trying to rival what they said, their Eastern ancestor in this great growing work of supporting women. So in 1892, Ottawa starts this Women's Council, and they called it a Congress for the Growing Women's Club Movement. So I was mentioning all this, like, suffrage was going on, and temperance. The Women's Club Movement, the General Federation had it start in 1890, and Kansas had a huge population of women's clubs as well. And you're going to be seeing some of these in pictures as I go. By the way, this is a picture of the dining tent, like dining hall area. As I said, that photo was going to be coming up at some point. So the Women's Council published a women's club directory in their monthly newspaper. And again, it's probably still hard to read even on your computer screen, but I like to show this as an example because I had mentioned that this monthly paper, they really try to use it for promoting their summer assemblies. So like who was coming, the programs, the attendees, but in the off months, so you can see in December here, they allowed the Women's Council and women's clubs to take it over. And so women's clubs use this as a club directory and club notes. So they essentially communicate to each other through this paper. And this was pretty significant at this time, because if you think about it, in 1893, women and women's clubs did not necessarily have a ton of avenues in which they could publish this kind of work. And so for the Ottawa Chautauqua to set aside their, a few months of their newspaper for this really was a testament to what they were trying to be. And in fact, they were really trying to intentionally bring all these club women together, not just in the paper, but actually to their summer assembly. And they prided themselves by saying that they hoped that the seeds of organization would be scattered broadcast over the beautiful prairies, resulting in a women's club in every town, village, and school district in the state. And here we have possibly two of my favorite photos of this entire, all the photos that I share. And I'll start with the one on the left, which they call a parlor tent. And it's just great details with the hats, the embroidery, the books that these women are all doing as they're sitting together. But I think what's fascinating about calling this a parlor tent is that if you think about the parlor being the place where the public can enter the private space of the home, the fact that even in a place where you are camping out in public, you are going to still try to emulate this idea of a parlor where the public would enter your little private sphere of the tent. But the photo on the right is a photo of a group of young women, and this is a group that they call themselves the Hobgoblin Club. And the reason I love this photo is because I looked it up, and a hobgoblin, you may know, is a mischievous imp or sprite. And I am just dying to know what group of women would decide to call themselves after a mischievous imp or sprite. And they do appear to be younger, and so my theory is it could be a group of college students, but regardless, it's a great name and some great photos. So back to Shaw and Anthony. In 1892, they show up in Ottawa, and the papers, not just the Chautauqua paper, but the papers of the town are saying that this visit was an honor for Ottawa never before enjoyed. And so in addition to supporting women's clubs, the Women's Council did not just emphasize and try to uplift these clubs, but they were also allowing this to be a place to discuss suffrage. This was radical, because it was commonly held at this time that women's clubs did not discuss three things: religion, politics, or women's suffrage. And so for this women's club focused group at a religious assembly to host suffragists, this I believe, and I argue, it was a reflection on the progressive nature of Kansas during this time period. And if you think back to that suffrage timeline, all of this is churning and talking about what suffrage is going on in the state. This is how that is reflected. So Laura Johns, who I've pictured here, was the president of the Kansas Equal Suffrage Association. She urged all the state workers to come to the Ottawa Chautauqua. And so they were really seeing this as a place where the Chautauqua would help to have these different ideas. They would come to discuss, to think, and then to go out and spread the push for suffrage. Now, sadly, as you saw from my timeline, they did not get the vote in 1894, and the story would have been much more fun if they had. But it was, again, almost 20 years later when they were successful in 1912. And what's interesting is that by the time 1912 came around, the Ottawa Chautauqua was on its last legs. It actually came to an end in 1913. There was still a women's council, but it was a lot less active than what it had been in 1894, when it was really using its paper and using its platform to get these prominent women speakers in. And so it didn't have the same level of action, although it did allow a debate on suffrage on the platform. Okay. So this next photo, I usually ask the audience to take a second and tell me what they see. And so feel free, if you want, to actually unmute yourself. You can shout out some answers, or you can use the chat, but just take a second and study this photo. Is anyone brave enough to? I'm looking at the chat. No one? Well, in this picture, I know you likely are thinking internally, you're seeing a few things. We have what is pictured a luncheon at the Chautauqua. Oh, I've got a couple of chats. Yes, good. There's one man. Yes, you spotted the guy who's jauntily sitting over on the side. Black women serving, Black servants. Yes, good. I've primed you with the title of my slide, but I like to have you take a second to look at this, because I truly believe that this photo might be the most significant photo I have come across in my research. This is from the Franklin County Historical Society. And yeah, as you can see, it is a group of mostly white women sitting around eating lunch with what appears to be two African-American women, possibly this woman, possibly Native American, but for sure two women of color, who are serving in the back. And I think we know that they are not participating in the lunch because there do not appear to be any empty chairs. They are holding dishes. And so this picture is so significant because it is very rare. I have not found many photos of non-white people at the Chautauqua. And here are two women, but they appear to not be participants, but working. And I'm not sure who these women are. I don't know if they are servants of one of the women at the table. I always kind of think if they are, it's this woman. I don't know why. She just seems to have the most authority over here, if you can't see my mouse, on the kind of the frontmost on the right. But they could be locals that were hired. I'm not sure. Where did they go during the day? Where did they stay? I have so many questions from this, but the reason that I want to show this photo, and I'm actually going to show this political cartoon as a comparison, and it's a reason why I wanted to bring Chautauqua and suffrage together, because the same people who were participating in Chautauqua, who were going to these lectures, who were part of this white Protestant middle class, who were, all like going and traveling every summer, were likely a lot of the same women, primarily women, but also men, who were in the suffrage organizations, in the temperance groups, in the women's clubs. And during this time period, what we know is that they were segregated by race. And this political cartoon, which I've lost my date on this, I'm not sure where it went, but it's from the early 1900s by a local artist, Albert Reed. He created this, and you can see it says color line in the middle, written by the white woman on the right, who's holding a General Federation of Women's Clubs, and looking at the Black woman on the left, who has a bow in her hair that says colored clubs. And so this similar demographic is really why I felt it was so important to bring these groups together, because to understand how ideas are spread, and Chautauqua was this movement of ideas. And I think if it's continuing to reinforce these social beliefs at the time about race and who was really allowed to be part of these groups. And of course, African Americans started their own groups because they really were not allowed in these mainline groups, and they agitated and pushed for suffrage as much as white women did. But just to really, as we think about the story we tell about suffrage in Chautauqua, you can't separate race from it. So to wrap up, I know we're getting close to our time. Ottawa was not the only assembly to support suffrage, but it is a great example to study. So Anna Howard Shaw, who I've mentioned a couple times, spoke at 20 different Chautauquas in 1901. And she became president of the National Association for Suffrage just a few years later. And she was president for 10 years. And during that time, you see that there was a significant connection between Chautauqua and women's suffrage. So during a time when women were really pushing back against this boundaries and definitions of separate spheres and gender roles, the Chautauqua became this place where women learned from each other. They were able to practice their organizational skills, and they were activated to campaign for political reforms. So Chautauqua, of course, was not the only means of campaigning for suffragists, but by the early 20th century, it was likely one of the most effective ways of reaching thousands, if not millions of people, because of the heightened popularity of this movement. So tracing the narrative from 1874, when Chautauqua started in New York, with John Vincent not condoning women speakers, to the early 20th century, when women had successfully claimed this place on the platform to talk about suffrage, shows how women were able to take this public space and turn it into something that was suitable for their needs. And so for this time, the Chautauqua movement was really at the heart of this rapidly growing women's movement, and in a place like Ottawa, often supported women as they pushed to change their position in society and the public sphere. All right, questions?
Sarah, let's start with a couple of questions in the chat.
Okay.
First off, would you go back to that picture of the women sitting around the lunch table?
This one?
Yes. There was a question, an observation that the woman that you identified as being the most powerful woman there, and one of the Black servers seemed to have the same fabric.
You are right. Ooh, see, I'm already loving this virtual format because you all can take a close look at these photos. Mm-hmm. Good catch. Thank you to whoever pointed that out.
Okay, and the same person, thank you, Susan, for these suggestions, is going back to want to know about how prevalent problems with alcohol were back then. Was it really such a huge problem, or were these temperance women more active, alternative but vocal types who got a lot of attention in the media because they were women?
Good question.
I have some relation to that as well. My grandmother was involved with the Kansas temperance movement and used to tell stories, and had some men who became very well known in the temperance movement in Kansas that she was so proud they were her Sunday school students.
Yeah.
So I relate to that. So how prevalent was alcohol? How big an issue was it?
So it was a pretty big deal by the time we get to the late 19th century, and it's because of the type of alcohol. So alcohol has been a part of the history of the United States since its beginning. But what happened is that most of the alcohol that people were drinking prior to the Civil War was pretty weak, like really weak beer that people were making at home. And you get into the Civil War beyond, what you have is you start to have higher content of alcohol being produced and being drunk. And so you get your harder liquors and whiskeys, and you have your saloons popping up. And so you're not just doing this home brew where it's going to be really weak beer that farmers are drinking, in the middle of the day, type of a structure, more in the agricultural part of our country's history. And so this switch to like a higher content of alcohol And also this kind of development of this like public and private sphere and separate spheres ideology, and men being more out in this public sphere, and they were gathering in saloons, and this was becoming and like fraternity halls and fraternal orders and stuff like that. You start to see the spike really occur at post-Civil War. And there's also some thought that possibly Civil War soldiers were using alcohol to get away from their pain and to deal with what we know as PTSD and so forth. So the answer, I would say, is that alcohol was a problem, and that a lot of women really saw this as a problem. It was a moral issue because of what was happening in the homes when men were coming home if they had drunk too much, and drinking away income. But also, I think too, it was kind of possibly partly that women, this was a chance for them to be politically engaged. So it could be a little bit of both, but it was an issue that women were able to rally behind because it was still respectable enough for them to maintain this kind of their dominion over the home, like this like home protection idea, but still be respectable and not lose that respectability.
Okay, there aren't any more questions in the chat. Does anybody just want to unmute themselves and ask a question to Sarah? It's not that scary.
You can even show your video. I love this. I'm glad I could do this virtually, but it is sad to not look out and see a sea of faces as if we were in person. But
we would like to say thank you very much for presenting this to us.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you joining me tonight. It's I'm sure you can tell I love talking about this, so I've been missing not having the opportunity to do so.
Before everybody leaves, I would also ask you to watch for another program on women's suffrage that UFM will be sponsoring in the fall catalog. Don't have a date or a time or a location for it yet, but do watch for another one in this series as we get close to the celebration of the 19th Amendment. Any other questions for Sarah? If not, I would say thank you, Sarah, for being with us tonight and participating. It was entertaining and very educational. I learned a few things myself. And I'll turn my video back on so that you can see me. Here I am.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, everyone. And feel free. I know I don't have my contact info, but you can find me and contact Linda, and feel free to share my Gmail account. If you do have a question later, I'm happy to answer them. And I honestly learn so much from these presentations because of people's questions and comments. So.
Okay, well, thank you all for joining us tonight. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you. Thanks, Linda.